Hello there, this is Greg Brail from Apigee. I'm here with Scott Ganyo.
Hi.
And we're here to talk about Node.js. We're going to talk about how we actually use Node.js in Apigee Edge. For those of you who have been with us for a while, the product formerly known as Apigee Enterprise is now Apigee Edge. So don't be confused, it's not a new thing, but we are going to use the new name for the product during the talk. And what we're going to talk about mainly is how do you use things with Node, what can you do with Node, and what can you do with Node in Apigee. We'll also talk a little bit about Volos, which is an open source project that we've created to make it possible to do more API and API kinds of things on Node.js. That's us, by the way, and as always, with all Apigee webinars, the video of this will go up on YouTube in a couple of days after it gets condensed and edited, and the slides will go up on SlideShare very soon after, so there's no need to worry about whether you're going to get the slides or take extensive notes unless you really want to. These particular slides, there's actually a lot of information in this webinar, and we're going to be doing some demos. We're going to make sure the slides have links to all the relevant GitHub repositories and demos and documentation and things, so that afterwards you can actually go to these places and try this stuff out. This is going to be a very hands-on webinar. Other thing that actually, it's been a little while since I did a webinar, brand new in the last few weeks, is our new site community.apigee.com. It's got blogs, it's got forums. This is a site for sharing information and having conversations with people in the community. We've created a group in community.apigee.com called Node.js. And in there, we're certainly there. Those of us at Apigee working on Node are available to answer questions, all the time. And we're hoping that we can actually build a nice community there, hence the name. So here's what we're going to go over with. We're going to start by just talking about the stack. Node.js. We're going to assume that most of you have some familiarity with Node.js. If you don't, I don't think we'll get you too lost. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what Node.js is, but some of the other things. We're going to demo building some very simple APIs with Node.js on the Apigee platform. We're going to deploy it in Apigee Edge in our cloud. And we're going to talk about basically building a more complete, extensible API using Volos. We'll talk about all of that stuff during the webinar. We hope to have it all, content wrapped up in about 40 minutes, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So let's get started with an introduction to the stack. Starting down at the bottom, and actually this is a great intro, but I think I got some slides that actually explain each of these. So just what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about Node.js. We're going to talk about Volos, which is our middleware for API calls. And we're going to talk about some web app and API frameworks very briefly. And the reason why we're going to talk about that is because out of the box, Node.js has built-in modules like an HTTP module. And you can do everything with just those modules. You don't need to use any third-party stuff. But once you start building APIs and wanting to say, here's what I do when I do a /get on /dogs or a post on /owners or whatever, it becomes much easier to use some of these pre-built frameworks. And that's why we're going to talk about them a little bit as well. So the first thing we'll talk about is Node.js, and this is about as much time as we'll spend explaining what Node.js is. But Node.js is a server-side platform for JavaScript. If you go to the home page, it's described as essentially an event processing engine for Node.js. You can actually build all kinds of things in it. You can build command line tools. You can build servers that listen on the network. The most common use case for Node.js is building web apps, and specifically building HTTP apps, which can be web apps or APIs, depending on how you look at it. What's made Node.js interesting and got a lot of people excited about it is the extent of support and the giant community it has. JavaScript is apparently the #1 language on GitHub. The stat that I pulled up is there were over 6,000 modules a year deployed to the Node.js package repo for the last 4 years. There's almost 50,000 modules in that repo. It's actually growing faster than any third-party packaging system, including Maven or whatever the Ruby thing is called, or PyPy. Gems, that's what it's called. There's an incredible amount of effort going into the community. It means things change a lot, but the core has gotten pretty stable. There are a lot of good people working on it. And it's really, it makes it easy and fun to build some of these apps. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, and the other thing is it's just hugely optimized for stream processing.
Yes, it's excellent for
complete asynchronous, very low thread use.
Yeah,
it's an extremely efficient processor for that.
Yeah, so, and the nice thing about it is that as a programmer, I've done a lot of Java programming, and I've now done a fairly lot of Node programming, and it's Node keeps you from doing some of the dumb things that you have to think really hard not to do in Java. We're going to talk about a few other frameworks. I'm going to talk about a couple of other quick frameworks that are part of the Apigee family. One I'm going to talk about is called Argo. Argo is actually created by Kevin Swiber, who's an Apigee guy. Argo is a framework for APIs, and I'll show an Argo example in a bit. There's a very popular Node framework that I don't think I have a slide about called Express, which is basically lets you, you'll see some samples later, lets you do things like, again, get/dogs. It was designed for web apps. It's very simple, very easy to build simple APIs in Express. Kevin created Argo because he wanted to be able to have something that was a little bit more flexible for APIs, and specifically for API proxies. Running an API proxy is a big part of what we do with Apigee Edge. We sit in front of existing APIs, we transform the data, so on and so forth. Argo is a way to do that in Node, and we have an Argo example coming up. And there's a lot of great stuff on the site for Argo. Other project we'll talk about quite a bit in this presentation is called Volos. Now, okay, we ended up with a mythological name here. Kevin picked Argo as the name for his project. Argo was the name of the ship that Jason sailed on to go find the Golden Fleece. He came from Volos. So we were looking for mythological names, so we ended up with Volos.
We're on a quest.
We're on a quest, exactly. What Volos is we wanted to take a lot of the things we've learned about APIs and API management in the enterprise over the last couple of years at Apigee, and we wanted to do two things. We wanted to create some open source modules that allow you to deploy those and to use them in a variety of cases. We also wanted to make sure that Apigee was the best place to run those, so that you have essentially a sort of all-encompassing way that you can build an API, you can add things that are critical to its success, like proper rate limits and quotas and OAuth support. You can then test it and run it locally. You can deploy it without Apigee and not use any of our stuff if you don't want. Or you can deploy it to Apigee, and it'll run very nicely on Apigee and integrate with all of our nice stuff.
Yeah, and an interesting thing about that is you actually have three modes of operation. One is entirely local through a in-memory or Redis support. You have a proxied version where you run it local, but it proxies up to Apigee.
Yep.
And then you have the version running entirely on Apigee.
Right, and we're going to show you how that works in a little bit for each of the modules. The reason we're doing that is because we wanted to say, okay, what's a good way to do OAuth in Node.js? Here's a programming interface for OAuth. It supports the full, all the bearer token spec and all the different authorization, all the different grant types in the OAuth base spec. They could certainly be extended for stuff like JSON Web Token and stuff as well if someone wanted to. And the idea was make that interface generic and then make it possible. Because a really nice thing about Node is that you can do everything on your laptop. And it's just a really, really fast development environment.
Right.
But you're not going to run in production on your laptop. So the idea is now you can deploy to Apigee. There you get our analytics, you get our distributed stuff, you get a lot of failover, it runs across data centers. If you already have Apigee in your organization, you don't have to change anything to deploy this. In fact, if you already have Apigee in your organization, you already have access to all this stuff. It's already in the product. So that's, in fact, what I just said. But this is basically about deploying Node.js applications to Apigee. So what I'm going to do now is we've kind of given you the overview. We're going to talk about Volos later. What we're going to do is we're going to then dive down into some specific stuff here and talk about how you use Node.js with Apigee. And we're going to start with some really simple stuff.
Right.
We'll show some more complex examples. Then when we get to Volos, Scott's going to take over and talk about the Volos code and show a slightly more complex Volos example. So here's the demo in building something in Apigee. Okay, should be looking at Google Chrome now. So what we have here is I've logged into, the URL still says enterprise.apigee.com, but this is Apigee Edge. This is the platform that if you guys are an Apigee customer already, or have used Apigee in the cloud, you've seen. And by the way, free trial on the web, anybody can sign up for free, so please go to enterprise.apigee.com or just apigee.com and click sign up. Here's the API platform where you're going to get to this stuff. First thing I'll do is I'll show you just, basically, we wanted to make it fairly simple to write a basic Node.js proxy in Apigee. So for instance, I have a lot of Node samples. I do this a lot. I can actually use this wizard. And this wizard is actually going to create a Node.js app right in my UI. It's going to deploy it, and it will work. And then it'll be basically deployed to Apigee, and it's running. So here, if I go back and click on Develop, here's my Node app. If you've built anything with Node.js, you probably will have seen this already. This is a very typical Node.js app. It uses the HTTP module, which is the thing in Node that actually allows you to listen for requests. Obviously, as it can write stuff to the console, we've created an HTTP server and listen to it. Mm-hmm. This is essentially the core of the Node.js support in Apigee today. It's wired into the HTTP module. And the way it works is you run a Node.js application that appears in your Apigee app as a target. So to start with, I can just do this. I can just use this as a platform for hosting Node apps. It's deployed, it's running. However, I'm going to go to another proxy that because I have that all set up in my trace window. But you can see here again, same app. This app is running. I can go here to where it says deployment. I see it's deployed to my test environment. If I'm not sure how to invoke it, here's the URL that I will invoke it at. I already have that URL open in my Apigee console, so I'm going to send the request, and there you go. It worked. Now, the fun thing about this is that it's running in the Apigee environment. So for instance, if this revision is deployed, I can actually live deploy a change to my proxy, and then I can go back and, we've deployed a new version. So furthermore, it's an Apigee proxy, and if you've worked with Apigee proxies before, they have multiple revisions. There are multiple environments. There's a test environment and a prod environment. So all the things I can do in Apigee typically where I can have different revisions, I can be working on a different revision in test, then for production, all of that stuff is supported here. The other thing that we have is, of course, our trace capability is supported in Node.js. There isn't any special Node.js tracing yet, but if you've worked with Apigee in the cloud, you know that one thing you can do with any API is you can trace the requests. So again, I can send my request to my trace, and again I see, here it is. And if you've worked with Apigee in the cloud, you'll see all this stuff. Right now I have no policies defined, so all I really see is my client is Node.js. Here's what it sent back. This is literally what came back from my HTTP stuff. This is literally what went. And I can go down here in the trace and I can see the output from my script. This is critically important because sometimes you need a way to debug. So what we do here is each node that's running the Node.js code basically saves the last 4K of output, and it'll show up here in the trace output. And the reason why this is very helpful is, we're running in the cloud. You can debug all you want locally, and a great best practice, and we'll show in a sec, is how to work on all this stuff locally. But a great best practice is to be able to turn on debugging maybe via an environment variable and be able to actually see what I did. I'll stop my trace session. And by doing that, this gives you a way to do this in the trace. We're going to be enhancing the UI and the API in the next month or two, I hope, to be able to show you a way to search for these log messages in some other ways as well. So that's the basics of this stuff. One other thing I wanted to mention was the kind of interesting fact that by doing this, I have a Node.js app running inside Apigee. Now let me show you what this means. If you've already worked with Apigee, and if you haven't, it's probably a good time to learn. The way it actually works is you have something called a proxy, and the proxy actually has an endpoint, what's called a client endpoint, and what's called a target endpoint. And in between this client and target, we can put in various processing steps. So the app that was deployed for me, this is actually almost a null proxy endpoint. It doesn't actually do anything other than specify a base path and a virtual host to listen on. And the target endpoint, you'll see actually says here, it has something called a script target. This is the thing that says the target for this API proxy is actually a Node.js HTTP application. The reason this is really kind of cool is for two things. I'm going to switch to a different proxy now. I'm going to go to what's called Hello World with API key. And I can see that I can now, of course, combine this proxy with different policies. So now you see I have a verify API key policy, I have a policy that takes the query parameter off, I have a quota policy, and basically these are existing, sorry about that, these are existing Apigee policies, just like anything else that I can do in my Apigee tool. So the fun thing about this is, again, here's my quota based on all the stuff's in the API key. This was actually generated by the wizard, but this is basically an example where I have taken a standard Apigee app and added standard policies using the UI and all the policies we have on our policy editor, such as caching, threat protection, OAuth, XML to JSON, whatever you want. These are all available, and basically they sit in front of your Node.js app. So you can take an existing Node app, deploy it to Apigee, have all of this stuff running all in the same runtime, and get analytics on all of it without changing your Node.js code. Now, you're probably not going to want to run your Node.js app here in the browser for your whole life. You're probably going to actually want to work like a normal developer and actually run it locally on your laptop. And we have something, an Apigee deployment tool, which is in a Git repo called API Platform Tools. And this gives you a script called Apigee tool. I put the instructions in here so you know what to do. An Apigee tool lets you essentially deploy a Node app to Apigee. You take a local directory, you can keep it in GitHub, you can keep it wherever you want, keep it in ClearCase for all I care, and if you still use that. And then what it does is it packages up your Node app in a proxy like we just showed, and it deploys it to Apigee. It creates a new revision. You can deploy to whatever environment you want, you can add base paths. It's basically a command line tool. The other thing that this tool will do is it'll package up your NPM modules. It'll package up your Node modules folder. The reason we do that is because you might want to use some third-party code. Now it happens that we have pre-deployed very popular third-party modules like Express. Of course, the user grid module is there, the Argo module is there, the request module is there, the underscore module. Some of the most popular Node modules are already there, so you don't have to do that. But as you build a more complex app, you're going to actually use actual Node modules. So we will deploy your Node modules folder along with your app, and that will allow you to upload any third-party code you want. The reason we do it that way is because that is, in the Node world, the one thing that will work for everybody all the time, which is we'll deploy exactly what modules you tell us to deploy. We're looking forward to designing and building some system where we'll automatically resolve your package dependencies. The various platforms for Node hosting have different ways of doing this. It's not always easy to do. It doesn't always work every time. Right. So for now, this is what we got, and it's something that is very consistent. That's all that I have there. Anything else about the basics of running Apigee on Node that I should be talking about?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty well covered it. You might have noticed that there was a listen on a port number.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I get this question a lot. What's this port? When I run this app, it's actually inside an Apigee API proxy. So when you deploy to the Apigee cloud, you don't pick a port. We're not going to let you deploy an app to our cloud that listens on whatever port you want.
Right.
So that basically we ignore that port number and we deploy to the virtual host that's defined when you deploy your proxy. Other platforms do it that way. Some platforms set an environment variable called port. I think we're going to start changing our examples to actually use that in case we want to change in the future. But basically, that's a very good point.
So you never have to worry about a conflict.
You don't have to worry about that, right?
Yeah.
By the way, this is. Why don't I actually bring up a slightly more complex example? For instance, here's one. Well, we're not quite ready for Volos. So let's bring up this one here, which is called the Argo retail. The Argo dogs example is pretty good. No. I'm sorry. I knew what I wanted to do, and then I went off the rails. I'll show the Argo retail demo. Just to show that, by the way, you can upload multiple API proxies. You can upload third-party Node modules. Here's one that's got a bunch of things. You see that our deployment tool actually zipped up our Node modules folder. But if I look at our server, this uses a whole bunch of third-party modules. So the point being that, and all of these things run on Apigee. It uses Volos, but it also uses Siren, which is something Kevin wrote. Underneath, it uses a number of other modules. The idea here is that, if I look at my app, that's just a small thing. But the idea here is that, this is a pretty full-fledged Node environment. You can make outgoing network calls. If you want to talk to an LDAP server or a Redis server that's available on the internet from our Apigee cloud, you can certainly do that. You want to write files, you can actually write, there's actually a scratch area where you can write files, and no, you can't manipulate the file system outside of your code, but it's not going to be persisted. But don't use it as a database. But
it's in a sandbox.
Right, it's like a sandbox. But the point being that it's pretty full-fledged, it works pretty well. If your script exits, we'll restart it for you. If it keeps exiting over and over and over again, we're eventually going to give up on restarting it for you. But we're trying to make it a nice environment for running Node. One other thing I'll show, since we have a little time, what are some use cases for this? First use case, just building an API, right? So that's why I was showing, for instance, this Express module, which we'll get to the details of in a minute. But this uses Express, and Express actually has, there it is. Express actually lets you do things like very quickly define the behaviors of an API. So one use case for this is, I want to mock up an API. Mm-hmm. Perhaps my API is backed by UserGrid. Great example. Using UserGrid and Node.js together, you can build a whole API completely in Apigee, not deploy anything. Perhaps, and when I say UserGrid, I say it's actually, there's a part of Apigee Edge, which is a mobile backend as a service, right, but it's based on an open source technology called UserGrid. And the Node module is called UserGrid, so I'm going to say UserGrid. So there's one thing you might want to do with it.
Yep.
Another thing you might want to do with it is host a small web app. Often as part of our OAuth implementations, customers will say to us, okay, I got to log in a user. How am I going to log in the user? Oh, we got to host a little web app for that. Mm-hmm. Express is a great way to do that and very easy to do. Third thing you can do is you can do kind of composition and mashup kinds of things. So for instance, I have a mashup in here that I use for a lot of samples. It's one of these weather proxies where you send in your postal code and it tells you the altitude, and it combines a Google Maps geocoding API and a Google Maps elevation API. And what it literally does, if I go down to my server, it calls the geocode method. The geocode method calls the Google API. When that succeeds, it parses the response. It calls the other Google API. If that succeeds, it sends back a response. If not, it sends an error. This is a great kind of thing that you can do in Apigee today. But, and there's going to be a transition to Volos here.
I knew we were getting there.
Right, but you might not want to do it by editing XML and dragging and dropping icons. Right. That's great for some tasks. Some people are more comfortable programming. Right. What we're trying to do is make Apigee Edge a platform that you can configure using XML or using a UI, or you can program. Right. So here's an example of a mashup you could do with 2 extract variable policies, 2 assign message policies, and 2 service callout policies in the Apigee Edge UI. Or you can code it in one JSON, in one JavaScript file. Right. Different strokes for different folks, right? If you needed to mash up 8 APIs, 1 was XML, 3 were JSON, you wanted to make 6 calls in parallel because they all do the same thing, right, and create one nice little compact piece of JSON to send back to your mobile app, you're probably going to have more fun coding that up in Node. So that's
probably so.
That allows you to do this. By the way, we have the ability to host many, many hundreds or thousands of Node apps on our cloud. So the idea of doing what some of the leaders in the API world like Netflix do, and having a different API for each device type, and having the code for that API written on the server and written in JavaScript, because front-end programmers are really good at JavaScript, that's something that you can do on Apigee Edge today. And it integrates with all of our existing stuff, including analytics, developer portals, all that stuff. So if you're going to start potentially doing some of these things in code, you're going to need a way to code OAuth, and you're going to need a way to code quotas, and you're going to need a way to use a cache. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about Volos.
So, as Greg was saying, the idea is that I want to be able to develop my work locally and in JavaScript, but then be able to deploy it up to Apigee with minimal changes. And so the concept here is that we would support those through just some basic config changes, all that would be necessary, because our APIs are going to be the same whether your backend provider is Apigee or Redis or in-memory, whatever you want. And in fact, you can develop new ones if you wanted to do so. We have a test suite in front of each one to ensure that the provider is doing what it is required to do. So right now we have 3 modules. We have an OAuth 2, which has the Redis and Apigee backends. Basically, it's a full implementation.
It's got the 4 basic grant types.
Right.
It's got bearer tokens.
Yeah.
It's got a couple of extra Apigee bells and whistles, and we're going to probably do some more with it.
Right, right. And it has middleware that you can install into Express or Argo. And I'll show you how it's... Well, actually, you saw earlier a little bit of how it was installed into Express, but I'll show you again.
We'll do it in more detail. And for those of you who aren't Node.js gurus, the word middleware in the Node.js world means something that fits into a web framework.
Right, right. All it is something that sits in the pipeline of the request coming in or the response going out. And
it's a little bit of code that sits in between whatever the web framework is. It actually, I think the term was popularized in the Ruby on Rails world.
Right.
Which, having been in the middleware business for like 20 years, it's not what you think. It's a different use of the word middleware. Anyway.
Something sits in the middle. Let's just leave it at that. So we have OAuth 2.0. We have a quota module that allows you to set up your quotas by minute, hour, day, month, year. I
year started to get like, year. How many days are in the year? That's let's not get overly complicated with it yet.
So you can set those up by identifier, and it basically does what you would expect. It counts the number of calls according to what the information that you feed it, and tells you whether or not you're above your quota. We have in-memory Redis and Apigee backends for that. Obviously, in-memory, is ephemeral. Redis at least will, if your server has to restart, it'll keep your quotas, and then Apigee, obviously.
And the reason we have the Apigee backend is it gives you the distributed capability, where we sync up with the Apigee cloud. And actually, after we talk about this, I want to talk a sec about how the Apigee stuff works.
But I think that makes sense. Yeah. And then cache, which is really just, it's very simply that. It's like it's a key value store that you say, I want this cached for X amount of time, and during that time it will be available, after which it will not.
Right. And all 3 of these are intended to be building blocks. I'm going to mention 2 things. For instance, looking at OAuth, right? There's actually an OAuth module with methods like create access token and validate access token. There's also the middleware is what it actually makes it a little simpler to plug into either the Argo and Express frameworks. So Volos doesn't require anything. You can do it all naked Node.js HTTP. You can use it with Happy if you're building your own framework, and most of you probably are. Only kidding. Then it'll work with those. We put in support for for Argo and Express, because Express is extremely popular, and Argo is something that we've been using a lot.
And I think that's a good point. All of this is open source, and it's available. You can call it, you can change it, you can fork it. Obviously, the concept here is that we don't want to break the APIs.
Right.
So if we keep the APIs consistent, or I guess I shouldn't say the APIs anymore, the interface consistent.
The programming interface, Here's the other thing. All of these, we talk about having an Apigee backend. What does that mean? What it means is there's a special proxy that's part of Volos you deploy to Apigee, and it exposes an API for your particular Apigee organization. And the Volos code talks to that API. Why did we do that? We did that because we wanted to be able to develop locally and, for instance, have OAuth work exactly the same on your laptop as it will when you deploy it to Apigee. When you deploy it to Apigee, it talks directly to whatever Apigee organization you've deployed to. But when you're testing locally, you want to be able to actually test this stuff. So that's why this Apigee backend has a mode where it makes API calls to an adapter. That also sometimes is a nice deployment model for people who use Apigee anyway. There are people who want to use all the API management features of Apigee, all of the developer tracking and the sophisticated quota capabilities, even things like monetization, but they don't necessarily want to always have a proxy. Well, this is actually a way to have that proxy run in Node.js.
Right. We do have a question up here. It says, if your app is using both HTML5 and Node.js, would it be better to use HTML5 local storage or the Volos cache that's going to be illustrated here?
Well, the Volos cache is a server-side cache.
Right.
So, and we're not trying to corner the market on caches. There are a lot of caches out there. The Volos cache is more of a cache interface.
Right.
So the in-memory interface is
Right.
JavaScript objects in memory. The Redis interface is just Redis.
Right. It basically just gives you more options, right?
Yes.
I mean, you have the options of caching in the browser.
Yeah.
You have an option of caching on the server, and so you can use them however you want in whatever manner best fits your application.
Yeah, and the reason why we have the Apigee cache is because Apigee Edge has a distributed cache built in. In fact, we can even do distributed cache across regions. And a lot of our customers in production make extensive use of this. So by having this Apigee cache provider for Volos, which is not in GitHub yet, but it will be soon, it gives you the ability to take advantage of that when you're coding in Volos, just as you can when you use Apigee policies. Right. So things we're looking at for the future in Volos are things like concurrency management. We're learning that in a lot of cases the best way to manage API traffic is not a quota that gives you an error after you've made 100 API calls, but something that says, hey, customer X, you're only allowed to make 10 API calls in parallel. Sorry, please wait. And now what we're going to do is you're going to use my laptop, I think, and we're going to share our idea. If you want to show them iTerm, we have to share iTerm. But we can switch to that.
Okay, we'll figure that out.
Or we can just share the desktop.
All right.
But you can walk through some of the pieces of Volos, and I'm going to walk
over
here and look at the other screen.
So we're going to dive into the code. I'm not going to get too technical on this, but I just wanted to show you how this is an example that I just wrote in the last couple days, just as a quick way to show how the OAuth, the quota, and cache pieces could potentially fit, and it's accessing Twitter on the back end to do a search, an API search. So the first thing I want to show you is what I call my Volos module, and which basically it's just the setup. It's a simple setup of which modules that we're going to use, and you'll see there on the screen that you have everything starts with the Volos, and then you have the next thing is the module name, and the next thing is the provider name. So in case of OAuth, I'm using Redis. In the case of quota, I've also set it up as Redis, and in case of cache, I set it up in memory. And those can be changed. I can switch from one to the other just by switching the names.
Right, and this is not magical Volos code. This is just Node.js.
Yeah, this is pure.
You haven't done anything
all of this
Volosian
is
yet. Yes,
JavaScript.
Okay.
Right. And then I export them so that I know which ones I've selected. And that's really all that does there. App.js is really the core of this application, right? So this is an Express app, and I'll show you the Express in a minute. But I've broken it down here. So as we come in, you see I'm requiring my Volos module that has my module information. I do initialize. I'm not going to show you that right now because all of that basically just sets up a database and the developer and the keys and all that, and we don't really need to get into that right now. And then I go to setting up the OAuth. So what you can see here is basically I get my Volos OAuth module, I tell it the configuration that I want, and I want to be able to support client credentials, authorization code, implicit grant, password, the basic OAuth stuff. I can assign it the password check method, which is very simple. You do whatever you want here.
So this is for the OAuth password grant type.
Right, the password
If someone
grant
makes a request for an access token with the password grant type, they're going to pass Volos their username and password.
Right.
How are you going to check whether they're valid? Well, Volos doesn't solve that for you. You pass in a function.
Right.
Call into LDAP. That works in Volos or Apigee. You can query a database.
Exactly.
You can do what Scott did.
So you need
whatever.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. All this does is it makes OAuth easier to use, to implement in the back end. So you have to know a little bit about OAuth. You have to know what these things mean, because you're exposing them. But in general, you don't need to know much more than that. You don't have to read the spec.
Right.
Which I did, with lots of fun. So that's all this does. And then I do a create. So I go ahead and this is my OAuth implementation right there. And you'll see as I get down into my Express, now you saw something like this a second ago. Greg showed it to you. This is how you install that middleware. And all I'm saying is that I want to expose that through my API as an authorize endpoint, an access token endpoint, invalidate and refresh endpoints.
So if you've ever done anything with OAuth in Apigee or in code, you'll recognize this,
Yes.
and you'll say, oh, I get that. And if you haven't,
Right.
then you're getting an example of how
Right.
one programs with Volos and Express.
Right. And you can pretty much just copy and paste that. The app use basically will say that anything that's not actually defined, anything that would be served automatically by
Like a static
Express,
file, for instance.
static files would have to be also authenticated.
Right.
And then I have my endpoint. And basically, in my endpoint, I'm saying I want to expose it as /Twitter. I want to authenticate, which I just showed you the OAuth portion. I'm going to enforce a quota, which I'll show you in a second, and then run the Twitter search. And those actually happen in that order. And then it's just app listen just starts it up.
And in the Express term, that is middleware. Is
Right.
basically saying, before I actually run Twitter search, which is the thing that does the
Right.
API call, I'm going to call these other functions.
these
first.
things have to happen.
Yep.
So it's forcing it to be authenticated through OAuth, and it's enforcing a quota
Yeah.
before I run the search.
Yeah.
So I'll show you the quota here. So when I create a Volos quota, basically I have to give it just very little bit of information. The time unit, which I was talking about earlier, minutes, hours, days, the interval, and how many I want to allow. So what this tells me is that each minute I allow two calls. After that, they're disallowed. It's that simple.
And actually, when you call, well, right, that's the default. You can override that on a per call basis, by the way.
Right.
Which is very important because you may want to have different quotas for different users, which
Right.
is a very common Apigee use case.
Right. Or you can create multiple quota objects.
Yeah.
And actually, each call well, look down a couple here. You notice I have a variable called hit, and that's basically just the definition of every time I hit the quota, I want to apply the weight, which is how many I'm adding to the quota, and the identifiers, which quota within that. I guess that's not very clear. Which
It's like the quota bucket.
bucket? Yeah.
So
bucket?
say you had a quota per, this would implement one quota for your whole API.
Right.
If that quota bucket were instead the OAuth consumer key,
Right.
which you can get from the previous module, or if
Exactly.
it was, the IP address, then it would be a quota per IP address.
Right. So all that can be, you can set whatever identifier you want in there, and then basically you just have to hit this apply. Method.
Yeah.
So searching for words here, and then you have to deal with it. So once you get the result back from that method, you'll either get an error or you'll get a result. The result will tell you if it was allowed. If it was not, then you return a 403 and just say, I'm sorry, you've exceeded your quota.
It's pretty simple.
And that will, if I return that here, it won't go on to my Twitter call. It'll stop. Okay? Don't really need to look at the Twitter call. This is actual call itself.
Leave that as an exercise for the reader.
Yeah. There's a whole module that deals with Twitter, and I'll show you a little bit of it, but this basically just calls that. And that's about it. So that's the app.
Right. So I mean, we're really only doing two things in Volos here, right? We're checking OAuth and we're checking the quota.
Right.
We're checking OAuth by calling one method. We're checking the quota by calling one method.
Right.
And you can see how you could combine these with lots of other configurations and other modules and things.
Exactly.
Really any way you want. And the point of this is when you want to do this kind of thing by programming, here's a way to program.
Right. Well, there's one more thing that I did actually, because I thought about it and I thought, calling Twitter over and over and over wasn't a cool thing. So I thought I'd go ahead and cache it. And I did
good
that.
idea.
And I did that in the Twitter module itself. So, this first method here is just running a straight search against Twitter, and every time I call it, it goes out to Twitter and says, give me this search.
You're using the standard HTTP module for that? Or?
Actually, I'm using a module called
Twit.
Twit.
Okay, cool.
It handles, makes it nice and easy for me. And you can see also here I'm using underscore to do a little formatting. It's very simple stuff there. But what I wanted to do is say, well, I don't want it to call out to Twitter every time because I might be running the same query over and over. And I have, quotas that Twitter's going to enforce on me.
Yeah.
So I want to say I'm going to cache it for 5 seconds. And this is what I'm doing here. So I'm saying I'm going to create a cache called Twitter and give it a time to live of 5 seconds. It's in milliseconds. Now, instead of calling search from my app, I'm going to call cached search. It's going to, basically, what you see here is it's going to do a cache get. If that's there, I'm going to return that.
So that means you cache hit if you actually get a reply object.
Right. And that's on the key. That's on the query itself. It's not for every Twitter thing. It's only for that particular search. So any given search will only happen once every 5 seconds. Mm-hmm. And then if I don't get a hit, I'm going to call the regular search. And I'm going to set the cache. And it's as simple as that for implementing the cache around this. So let me go ahead and, if we can...
Oh, right. So what I'll do is we will... what you want to share... iTerm?
Yeah.
No, okay, there we go. There we go. I didn't update that.
Okay. So hopefully everybody can see this now. Basically, I just started a Redis server. It's a completely empty server here. And what I'm going to do is here start my app. And you'll see a little bit of text there.
That's the stuff you printed out to make it easier to debug.
Right. Right. So I printed out the list of all of my endpoints here. I said where I'm listening. This is initialization that happened when I said I wasn't going to cover that. That's in the init. It gives a client ID, client secret for the app that I just created. And I go ahead and generate an access token for myself just to make that easier as well. What you'll see here is 2 curl commands. One, this is actually how you would get a password token from the API. And you notice, so I'm accessing the localhost app that I created, and I'm accessing the endpoint access token. And this is just OAuth stuff. So I'm saying the grant type, the client ID, which is right up here, the client secret, which is here, and a username and password.
And remember the password check function we checked before.
Right.
That's what's getting called when you call this.
So if I run that curl command, this is what I get. I get a new access token, and I can use that now in my calls. And it expires in, what is that, a day?
Yeah, I think so.
And it gives me a refresh token. So all of the standard OAuth stuff, if you're familiar with it. But more interestingly, I can do a Twitter search here. So this is actually going to use a different access token. This is the token that I generated a second ago. But I'm going to search for Apigee on Twitter. And, well, look at that. There's a programmability talk.
Oh, good. Excellent. We should join.
There's a demo. So you can tell this is actually live. We didn't make this up. And that's really it. So now, but what's interesting here is going back, you see my quota, I've allowed 2 in my call. I've used 1 now, so this is allowed. And I see that I've actually run a Twitter search. Now I'm going to do it again and again and again. And I've exceeded my quota.
So now we've got an Apigee demo. Okay, no, that's cool. So the interesting thing about this is that without too many changes in this code, you could have put the quota behind the cache. So you only increment the quota when you fail the cache.
Right.
And again, once you put these building blocks together, and I should point out this is a pretty complete OAuth implementation. We've got refresh tokens automatically implemented, invalidate automatically implemented with 1 line of code.
Yeah.
So you kind of pull these things together, and you can see how if you were a Node.js programmer, in case some of you on the phone are not, I apologize, there's a lot of code in this For once,
Right.
people are going to say, there was too
Too
much
much
information
code.
in your
Too much
webinar.
code.
You could easily mix and match these things and build all
Right.
kinds of other interesting things programmatically. Test them locally on your laptop, deploy to Apigee.
Yep.
Work totally in the open source world if you want. Work in the Apigee world.
Exactly, exactly. And just very quickly, going back to this,
Yeah.
you'll see that as I printed it out, I'm
Yeah.
using the quota,
Yeah.
and that I did return one of the responses from the cache instead of running a Twitter search.
Excellent.
So it's all there.
Cool.
And that would be the demo.
That's so. And what I'm going to do now, since we're running towards the end, is I'm going to bring up a couple slides that have a lot of links to all of these things, so that you don't have to remember everything. Oh, that whole time I shared two applications anyway.
Never.
So you don't have to remember everything. So here we put in the slides some of the code we were looking at. This is a different example. It's an express example.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much simpler example, just /dogs, but it doesn't do as much because all it does is it returns a name of dogs, 4 dogs. And then, similarly, here's the stuff you talked about before.
Yeah.
Finally, I wanted to leave time for questions if there are any. I don't see a huge number here. I wanted to leave and make sure on these slides there are a lot of links. In the beginning, we talked about Node.js support for Apigee.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of really good documentation for it that's right now not as easy to find as we would like, so there's a link. You can also search apigee.com for Node.js and you'll find it too. Home pages. Volos is a GitHub project. Lots of README code, lots of samples there.
Mm-hmm.
Apigee samples, the Apigee platform tools we talked about, and finally some links to the exact samples, including the sample that Scott just looked at. This link right here, under the samples/webinar link in Volos, is the actual code that Scott was just demoing. And finally, some information about Argo. And the last thing is my little pet project, Trireme, which is actually how this stuff runs on Apigee. We're actually running it on a Java VM instead of in regular Node. And that allows us to deploy many, many Node apps to our infrastructure. And it also allows us to integrate with other code we wrote. And it also means we could do it without having to hire 5 more ops people to learn how to run Node in production, because they're already running a lot of stuff in production. We did that by a JavaScript on Java implementation that we call Trireme. Time for questions.
So our first
Excellent.
question up here is Volos useful to me if I don't use Apigee? Say I just want to use quotas on my Express app on Heroku or something else.
Yes. I hope that we just showed the answer is
The
yes.
answer is yes, yes.
So what Scott just showed you was you can do it all totally open source with Redis. The Apigee adapter might be interesting for you to look at as well, because it keeps things like quotas in the Apigee cloud, which is highly available, distributed quota, blah, 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 good stuff.
Yeah.
And finally, you're free, or we're free to, if somebody really wants a MongoDB backend or a user grid backend would be interesting, even though it's Apigee stuff talking to Apigee stuff on top of Apigee stuff. All of that stuff is possible using Volos, and we're looking forward to people helping.
I answered that one.
So this is an Apigee specific question.
I understood that Node.js runs inside the JVM in Rhino, is that correct? And what type of performance should we expect comparable to native Node?
Okay, so the current implementation of Node.js on Apigee in our cloud and on premises runs inside the JVM using the Rhino JavaScript engine, using an open source project called Trireme. The reason we did that was because it makes deployment for us and our customers much, much easier, at least given the current state of everything. And it allows us to integrate with existing stuff we have inside Apigee, like our high-performance quota and cache and OAuth implementations. So that's why we did it that way. And the nice thing about it is you get all those nice benefits. Rhino is not as fast as V8. So if you want to port the V8 ray tracing benchmark to Apigee and run it in Apigee, it will not run nearly as fast as it does in native Node.js. However, HTTP applications that are using a lot of Java code anyway and a lot of network stuff run fast enough. I mean, I don't have a number in front of me. I can't tell you whether it's half the speed, a quarter of the speed, or whatever. It's not as fast as V8, but I think it's plenty fast enough, and we have the ability to deploy capacity as well. We can also do nice things like take advantage of lots of CPU cores if you are doing a lot of CPU capacity. Right. So we think that for us it's the right trade-off. Another fun thing about the Trireme project sort of outside of all this stuff is that I'm starting to think it will become a way for people to add Node code to enterprise production environments where it might not be an option. For instance, Maybe you already deploy 1 million Tomcat servers, and you really can't figure out how to get your ops guys to build and deploy Node. Well, you can use Trireme, and you can run Node.js apps inside those Tomcat servers without telling anybody what you did. So I think it's going to open some interesting use cases. We're starting to look at using it in conjunction with Hadoop for the same reason. There's a lot of Hadoop stuff that's Java. You want to talk to Cassandra, you want to talk to Zookeeper, you want to talk to HDFS. There are beginning to be Node modules for those things. There's also a lot of really robust Java code for that. Trireme is a way for you to do that. So those are all some of the reasons we did it, and it may or may not change in the future, but it's working very well for us now.
We are already an Apigee Enterprise customer.
Excellent.
Are all these goodies ready for us to start using?
Everything we showed you is live in the Apigee cloud today. The demos I showed you were live from production, and Scott's demo was on his laptop, but all that stuff is also in GitHub. This stuff was actually added to the product in our release 23, and there were some updates made in release 24. So if you have your own installation of Apigee Enterprise and you're on at least release 23, the answer is yes, it actually is available and you can try it out. It is considered right now, Node support in Apigee is technically public beta. Now, if you have a problem with it, we're going to work just as hard to fix it than if it wasn't public beta. But, if you're like a major retailer and you're going to rewrite all of your Black Friday apps to run on it, this weekend, I'm not sure that I would be excited about that. So, I would expect that over the next few months, as customers use it more, as we find more bugs, as we figure out the best way to deploy it and manage all the memory allocation and stuff, we'll take that public beta label off. But obviously, we will still continue to support you as well as we do whenever anything else happens.
And we should point out that Bolos is in Bolos itself, not Apigee, but Bolos is in rather active development.
Yes.
So some things are still changing. The APIs should be fairly static at this point.
Yeah.
But there may still be some changes.
Yeah. That's why it's version 0 point something.
Right.
That's also why the Apigee Node stuff is public beta. That means that we don't plan on making incompatible changes, but if we have to, because there's some deployment issue that comes up, then we told you it was public beta.
And I suppose I should make a disclaimer too, given that OAuth is a security product.
Yes.
I would not recommend at this point that you make our implementation of OAuth on Redis your implementation of OAuth. It's not gone through a level of hardening and testing that I would feel comfortable with anyone actually using that in production.
We're developing it as we speak. However, it's great for development, and
fantastic for development.
We fully intend to get to the point in the next few months that we can all stand behind it and support it for production use.
Yes.
I don't know if there are more questions. I see that we had some people drop off. I think this may have been more code than some people may have bargained for. I hope that you got useful stuff out of it anyway. If not, we give you pointers to a lot of great resources online, and at least you learned something about Node.js. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.